the 60s were, between 60 and 65 were the time where the most terrorist activity happened. Up to the Bay of Pigs, there were a number of Cuban, anti-revolutionary Cubans inside the country that were creating a great deal of havoc inside Cuba. One of the first programs that the Cuban government instituted was the literacy campaign, and it involved thousands and thousands of students going into the countryside to teach the farmers how to read and write. It was one of the cornerstones of the new revolutionary government's social justice programs, and helped increase literacy rates to what they are now, comparable first world standards. Well, during the literacy campaign, which lasted about a year and a half, there was about 100,000 students going into the countryside. More than a dozen were tortured and murdered by these anti-revolutionary terrorists that also killed a lot of the adult students. And in the book, there's a couple incidences of specifics. The sister of one who was incredibly brutalized before killed. These people were killed just because they were trying to teach farmers to read and write. And it was the attitude of the anti-revolutionaries was no matter what the government was doing, particularly if it was helping the people, they wanted to instill terror and to try and destroy it. In conjunction with that, almost at the same time, there was a program called Cine Mobile, where the Cubans would build specially constructed trucks that had projectors on the back of them, and they would go into the countryside and show commercial films, not newsreels, not politically oriented, but just like Charlie Chaplin films, comedies, Spanish and English, to the countryside. And these people had never seen these films, so it was funny how they reacted. They were attacked as well. There were people killed and a lot injured simply because they wanted to show these films to the countryside. So this is the depth and the intent. In the 1960s, after the Bay of Pigs failure, the United States government actually instituted a state-sponsored terrorism program called Operation Mongoose. And there was a tremendous amount of terrorist activities conducted under this program, and that continued until the missile crisis in 1962. Although it did right during the missile crisis, there were some acts of terrorism based on this program, and that complicated things to the extent where the missile crisis could have ended up a lot worse than it did.
Wasn't Operation Mongoose one of the things that McNamara apologized for when he was in Cuba? When he was in
Cuba, yes. Yeah, it was
really horrible. You should all Google Operation Mongoose, because what our government was plotting with that is really scary, and none of us knew anything about it.
This was controlled, financed, and coordinated by the State Department. Later in the 70s and the 80s, when the anti-revolutionary organizations in Miami took over the terrorist activities, at this time in the early 60s, it was all the United States government. There was an act in the 60s too, munition ship, La Cubre, that was in Havana Harbor. It was a French munition ship carrying Belgium armament. And it was one of the very few ships that came into Cuba with armaments because the Americans refused to sell and were putting tremendous pressure on the rest of the world not to sell arms to Cuba. And this was before there was official and formal relations between Cuba and Russia. So this ship, La Cubre, was in Havana Harbor, and it blew up. It killed 100 people, injured hundreds more. It was in Old Havana, destroyed 80% of the windows in Old Havana. There's still a monument in Old Havana dedicated to the incident. And the Cuban government did months and months of testing and showed that it couldn't have happened accidentally, because the munition ships, for obvious reasons, were very well protected when they were carrying the armaments. And the ship had been in Miami for 4 days prior, and the American government and the Cuban Americans, anti-revolutionaries, knew it was there. And so there's a strong evidence to support that the ship was sabotaged and killed so many hundreds of people. So the extent of the terrorism, the incidents are wide-ranging.
By the way, the very famous photograph of Che Guevara was taken at the memorial service for the victims of La Cubre. Was not a studio portrait, right? He was simply standing there during the memorial service, and that it has become the face of the heroic guerrilla.
Yeah, exactly. So the 60s were very active. In the mid-60s, late 60s, the Cuban government had basically eliminated the in-country terrorist bands of anti-revolutionary organizations in-country. A lot of the anti-revolutionaries had left Cuba, settled in Miami. So the 70s saw a change from American government sponsorship and control to more organizations in South Florida, Miami, taking over the reins of the acts of terrorism. In the 70s, there was one incident in one chapter in the book. There was an attack on this little village about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Havana called Boca de Sama. And it was like 14 homes, wooden homes, one church, one school, one store. Well, a band of terrorists from Florida belonging to the anti-revolutionary group Alpha 66 came one night and shot the heck out of the whole village. Every home was shot up, the school was shot up, the store was shot up.
Welcome to Vietnam.
Yeah, it was a complete military operation against this little village that was right on the north coast. It was, relatively speaking, fairly close to the United States, and maybe that was why. 2 people were killed. I interviewed a couple people, one who was shot 8 times and survived, and a 15-year-old girl who had her right foot shot off, and the horrors her and her family had to go through before they were rescued. And a couple days afterwards, the group Alpha 66 had a press conference in Miami saying that they had attacked a vital Cuban military objective. And it was this little town that had nothing, but it had been owned, the lands around it had been owned by the United Fruit Company. And the speculation of the people I interviewed was that they knew the people, the attackers, because they started calling them by name, and that they had been employees of the United Fruit Company and had left Cuba dissatisfied with the revolution. Couple of the people had never been interviewed before, and I went out there to the village and talked to them, and they knew I was coming out, but they didn't understand why, because one of them in particular, the person who had been shot 8 times, he said, well, when it happened, the Cuban government came out and there was something in the newspaper, but no one's talked to me about this since, well, it was 1971 when it happened, so over 30 years. So again, it was a way to get these stories for the people to tell their stories, and a lot of these incidents happened 30, 40 years ago, and the people were getting old. And so it was a way to put these stories in the historical record. So once the people are no longer there, their stories and their experiences will remain. The 80s were dominated by acts of biological terrorism. The 90s, in 1997, there was a bombing campaign against Cuban hotels and tourist facilities. If you remember 1997, after the special period in 89-90, the Cuban economy had collapsed and the government decided they were going to reinvigorate the tourism industry. The Canadians, I'm from Toronto, I'm Canadian, Canadian, so it was aimed a lot at the Canadian tourists, and the Canadians started coming to Cuba thousands and thousands. Well, in 1992 or 93, the anti-revolutionary organizations in Miami started targeting hotels. They'd be coming over in boats from Miami and shooting up hotels in Veradero. And there's still hotels, the Hotel International for one, that still has bullet holes. They'd come, they'd shoot their machine guns, hit the hotels, and scurry back to Miami. And they made announcements specifically saying any Canadian tourists who come to Cuba should be fearful of their lives. So the whole intent was to scare off tourism and to deny the Cuban government access to this new revenue stream. Well, in 1990...
Do you remember when there was a group of clergy, Canadian clergy, who started a campaign during this time urging Canadians to skip Florida for their vacation and go to Cuba?
Yes.
So that was because they were very
Yeah.
angry at our continued policy toward Cuba. And I'm sure that exacerbated the situation.
The Canadians don't come to Cuba for political reasons. They come because it's a cheap holiday.
And they go to Baradero.
They stay on the beach. They stay on the beach all week, and I know a lot of Canadians, and I say, well, how was Cuba? It was wonderful. The hotel was great. The people are friendly. Did you get to Havana? No. Why would I go to Havana? I want to stay on the beach all week. So they know Cuba from that perspective. It's like going to Cancun and saying, you know, Mexico. But anyway, in 1997, there was a series of bombs that over a 6-month period from April to September that went off in about a dozen hotels in Havana, as well as some of the more famous tourist facilities, the Bodeguita del Medio, the most famous cafe in Havana. It killed an Italian tourist who had a connection with Canada. And the person, again, who is recognized to be the coordinator for this campaign is Luis Posada Carrillos.
Our hero.
Yes, very, very well known. And the focus on the El Paso trial is more on his involvement, because in a series of articles with the New York Times in 1998, I believe, he basically admitted that he was involved in the bombing campaign with the intent of scaring tourists. And he said he wanted to have more publicity to make sure the tourists knew that, you know, they might get blown up.